Hello, and welcome to Building a CISO Response Strategy to Advanced Threats. My name is Jeff Kostel. I'm the Deputy CISO at ExtraHop, a cybersecurity company that specializes in network detection and response. As the CISO at a security company, I have spent a lot of time thinking about advanced threats, supply chain attacks, and how to improve our response strategy when the next Sunburst scale or Exchange scale attack shakes the industry. Today, I want to share some lessons learned during my career. I do want to mention that we are open for Q&A, and I can take some questions online before the general QA session at the end. Before we dive into the meat of the presentation, I want to set the stage by sharing two different CISO's threat response timelines. The CISO in dark blue manages a SOC that's more resilient to advanced threats. The SOC is more mature. Because they were more prepared, they have a shorter time to resolution. Versus the organization that's less resilient, which takes longer to resolve issues. My goal is to give you a framework to think about incident response and some immediate actions to improve your resilience so that you can respond faster and more confidently. At the end of this presentation, I want you to feel equipped to be the dark blue line, not the teal line. But why does a more mature shop have a shorter time to resolution? When you're in the beginning moments of an emergency, it can feel like you're wearing a cone of uncertainty. As soon as the news breaks, or you learn of a compromise, or you learn of an attack, your uncertainty is very large. Right? You don't know what's happening exactly. But as you learn more information, your uncertainty decreases to result in a more narrow cone. You can act on the information that you have, and those actions are what leads to a resolution, a final resolution. In this diagram, the organization with the more mature information retrieval process not only starts with less uncertainty, but has a faster path to resolution. In other words, the faster you can get information and reduce uncertainty, the faster your time to resolution. I want to point out that this agility at information retrieval builds on other key metrics also: resiliency, disaster recovery, RTO, RPO, and others. In order to help you become more resilient in the face of high impact incidents, as well as all other incidents, I want to discuss the following points. Reframe our existing mental models. Revise our incident response processes with steps to assess our risk, update where and how we look for answers, and to build resilience. I will also share next steps and summarize our learnings today. Let's start by defining what we mean by advanced threats. Advanced threats are those threats that are beyond the scope of the things that we normally worry about as CISOs, like phishing emails, insecure IoT devices, ransomware, botnets, and other threats. I don't want to downplay those threats. They are still quite dangerous, but they're relatively well understood threats, and we have tools to mitigate most of them. Here's what we know about the advanced adversary. They have patience and skills. They're using novel techniques, and they may have already made it past your defenses and are living off the land inside of your environment. In a sense, malicious insiders aren't unlike APTs. They have deep knowledge of your network, are good at hiding under the cover of legitimate operations, and in both cases, we don't deal with them very well because of the complexities involved. I will be discussing advanced threats and occasionally referencing the SolarWinds Sunburst campaign as an example. Since it was so widely covered, I believe it will be understood by everyone. The next advanced threat will look different than Sunburst, but the tips I share should be applicable across the board. Okay, so the adversary is advanced. So what? If the adversary is so advanced, then there are a few principles that we want to work into our defense. First, we can no longer blindly trust our logs because they've been potentially tampered with. An advanced attacker would attempt to delete or corrupt those logs. Traditional tools will be evaded. If we look at Sunburst, we know that the adversary was able to bypass certain tooling, in this case EDR, but it could be different next time. We know that dwell times for these attackers is often very long. Generally, that means that the inside view of what's happening in our environments is lacking. Otherwise, they wouldn't have such a long dwell time. Add that all up, and it means we generally don't have a holistic view of our entire environment. But there's more. Our investment in traditional tooling of prevention is inflated relative to the problem, that adversaries have already bypassed that tooling and are left to roam freely. And finally, attackers attack where there are assets. Why do bank robbers rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Attackers will go after your assets, and customers are assets too. This was immediately obvious when we shined the light of Sunburst on this problem. Clearly, the attackers were quite interested in getting into the customers of SolarWinds, not just SolarWinds themselves. For this rest of this deck, I'll be using the NIST incident response cycle as a framework to help fit new techniques into what we are already doing. I like taking large problems and breaking them into smaller pieces to make progress on them. Now, this cycle is straight out of the NIST 861 Incident Response Handling Guide. I simplified it just a little bit, but we'll get past that right away. So there are multiple stages here. Preparation. This step is about gathering information and setting up our policies and going through and just building a system that we can extend. Detection and analysis. This is the meat of what we do. We attempt to detect the bad guys and analyze their techniques, tactics, and procedures. Containment and recovery. This is the action we take when we know an attacker is operating. We first contain the bad actor, then recover and ensure that they no longer have access. Finally, there is post-incident activities. The NIST Computer Security Incident Handling Guide notes that, quote, one of the most important parts of incident response is also the most often omitted, learning and improving. That quote comes from the section on post-incident activities, one of the final steps in the cycle. Later, we're going to do small retrospective and examine some key facets of an attack and use it as an example to lay out some learnings and preparatory steps that can enable faster, more effective response to future advanced threats and supply chain attacks. Preparation. A key part of the preparation phase is, quote, selecting and implementing a set of controls based on the results of risk assessment. Some of this selection and implementation is focused on preventing incidents in the first place, which is important work to do, but over-investing in prevention is something that has limited value and diminishing returns over time. We may be better off focusing our attention on response techniques. This preparation step is where we ensure we have the ability to answer questions about our environment. If we don't have logs, or we don't have endpoint, or we don't have network data, then we're not going to be able to respond at all. As advanced threats and especially supply chain attacks impact greater and greater numbers of organizations, it grows more important to invest in internal investigation and response tools that are able to look backwards in time to discover attack exposure and get to the root cause of an incident whose initial compromise may have been in the past and may have come in through the supply chain or other method that has no chance of being detected by perimeter-based prevention controls. The second phase is detection and analysis. Many security tools have some mechanism for saving and correlating relevant data after they have detected a threat. This is an example of present and future-focused detection and response. Unfortunately, by only saving forensic data beginning at the point of detection, these tools give themselves and their users much less of a chance to get the root cause of an attack that started in the past. Unless you detect the threat instantaneously, which is relatively rare, you're losing valuable evidence by waiting to start saving data until some sort of detection fires. When advanced threats operate with dwell times anywhere from months to nearly a year in the case of the Sunburst attack, it is important to retain investigative data much longer into the past and assure that you have the capabilities and know-how to quickly access and analyze that data to determine root cause. This type of data is also useful for a piece of advice we'll get to later, learning from the attack and generalizing that knowledge to reduce the likelihood of being successfully hit by the same techniques again in the future. The third phase is containment and recovery. Security expert Bruce Schneier said in the wake of Sunburst that many organizations would have to burn down their IT environments and start from scratch to be sure that the threat was eradicated. This threat was active and stealthily growing its access and persistence mechanisms for such a long time that it would be very difficult to know you had it fully removed from your environment. In a perfect world where you have 100% visibility of everything in your environment, now and at every moment in the past, you could be perfectly efficient at cutting out only the affected devices. Nobody's that good, but you can make choices in your controls, your tooling, your configuration, and your policies that make it more likely that you'll have the right evidence preserved to confidently identify only those systems that need to be burned down, rather than rebuilding your whole environment from scratch. The more evidence, and crucially, the correct pieces of evidence that you preserve, the less likely you'll have to fully burn down and rebuild. Finally, post-incident. The NIST Computer Security Incident Handling Guide notes that, quote, one of the most important parts of incident response is often the most omitted, learning and improving. That quote comes from the section on post-incident activities, one of the final steps in the cycle. In this presentation, we're basically practicing this step, using Sunburst as an example to lay out some learnings and preparatory steps that can enable faster, more effective response to advanced threats in the future. We're going to analyze these 4 steps deeper, but I'm going to start at the end instead of starting at the beginning with post-incident and work our way forward from the beginning. Well, why do we do retrospectives? Well, we do them because you can bet that attackers are doing retrospectives and learning from their attacks. Attackers only get better. This leads to the famous escalating war, where attackers get better and defenders have to get better to keep up. The escalating war is really an innovation gap between the attacker and the defenders. One of the things I noticed right away about Sunburst was that it looked like there were multiple groups involved. One group was responsible for initial landing. One group was responsible for command and control, and one group was for subverting the build system. You can bet that each one of those groups did a retrospective just like you're going to do. Why else do we do retrospectives? Enterprises have other business goals and naturally fall behind the attacker. I'm reminded here of information asymmetry attacks. These are every child's tactic when they want a cookie. Try parent 1 first, and if the answer is no, try parent 2. Now, both parents may have access to the same information, but they use it in different ways, which ends up with different results. If the 2 parents had perfect communication, then the cookie attack wouldn't succeed. Sadly, that's not always true. Next, I want to talk about using a retrospective to build a more resilient and innovative defense. So when you're doing your retrospective, ask yourself the same question twice. The first should look backward, and the second should look forward. These are the questions that I always ask. What can we do that would have stopped this attack? And then looking forward, how can we generalize that to the next attack? How are we compromised or breached? How can we stop it next time? And you can break this down into multiple phases of the attack. There's the initial vector, lateral movement. There's lots of ways to break this down. If you have multiple questions to the first question, you can answer that question the second. How can we stop it next time? What assets were impacted? And then how should we protect those assets differently in the future to make sure that this doesn't happen again? What information do we need to be more resilient? And how could we get that information sooner next time? This is an important one. This is what we talked about very early in the deck about the cone of uncertainty and shrinking that cone of uncertainty as quickly as possible. How can I get the information that eliminates my uncertainty? Finally, why didn't we realize this was happening? And then an example kind of forward-looking is how can we improve, say, our MITRE attack coverage, or how can we make sure that this is not happening in the future? And there are frameworks under which to do that. The first phase, after we're done with our retrospective, we want to feed that back in and go all the way through the NIST cycle again. So the first phase in that is preparation. So we now have some retrospective data about our defenses, and we can be better prepared for the next attack. We go back to our preparation phase and prepare to handle the new attacker techniques. Ask yourself what your defenses look like before the threat and what you want them to look like after the retrospective, after you've analyzed the threat. The best way I've found to do this is to update the threat models that I keep. So the payoff of an updated threat model is huge. The more mature your threat model is, the more attack coverage you have. And this is kind of a natural thing. We're back to a cone here, but this time it's not a cone of uncertainty, it's a cone of coverage. When we first started doing threat models, our coverage didn't cover everything that we wanted it to. And we knew that, right? We had to try to defend what we could defend in the time we had. But over time, our threat models get better and better, and we take into account more real-world information about how bad actors operate. We evolved our threat model to cover a much more broad set of threats. And this is a natural evolution over time, and it's a good thing. As long as we're updating our threat model, it pays to go back and assess our risk and the visibility we have into that risk in light of these new attacks. I like to think of my estate in terms of the assets that I hold. The majority of those assets are going to be things coverable by endpoint protection, like my desktops, laptops, mobile devices. That's the middle part there. And generally those are well covered by endpoint agents or logging or what have you, the general tools that we already have. As an industry, we're already investing heavily in what's underneath the peak of the bell curve here. But there are other servers, cloud servers, IoT devices, and I still need visibility into those. And I'm not likely to get any endpoint or even any logs out of those. So I choose to use network visibility. It's going to have the broadest swath, and it's going to encompass all those devices. If they're talking on the network, they're visible via their network traffic. It's time to diversify our investments and invest where we have the advantage on the inside with this network data. Once we're more prepared with more data and the ability to answer more questions, it's time to move to the next phase of our NIST cycle, detection and analysis. Attack surface is ever expanding as we get more devices and more services scattered all around. Perhaps you've heard of the defender's dilemma. Today, I'm going to talk about the attacker's dilemma. Despite our defenses, there are so many ways to get past the perimeter. The perimeter is the dotted line down there at the bottom. The attacker's dilemma is that their playbook becomes much more limited once they've made it inside the perimeter. To accomplish their goals, they must move laterally and likely have to use some sort of command and control to broaden their access, establish persistence, or just generally achieve their goal, whether that goal is data exfiltration or simple destruction. The number of tactics, techniques, and procedures available for stealthy lateral movement within an environment is much smaller than the number of ways an attacker can attempt to compromise the perimeter in the first place. If you get good at detecting and investigating that handful of TTPs that attackers use once they're already inside, you can greatly improve your odds of preventing a breach, as well as accelerating your eradication, containment, and recovery stages. So, how can we see those attackers on the inside? Basically, you can look at the pyramid of pain and break it down by what's easily visible with signatures and what's not. The bottom part of the pyramid of pain shows information that is relatively easy to categorize. IP addresses, domain names, things like that are relatively easy. However, the very top of the pyramid, tactics, techniques, and procedures, they're very tough to detect because you can't reduce it to signatures. You have to look at the behaviors. And this brings me back to the bottleneck at the bottom of the last slide. The good news is that there are few behaviors available to attackers on the inside. Generally, they need to steal credentials or impersonate others or figure out how to move laterally or command and control. So if you focus on detecting those behaviors and retaining evidence for them post-compromise, for the post-compromise investigation and threat hunting, you can get the biggest bang for your buck. To put it another way, flip the attacker's dilemma into your solution. This can seem intimidating if you don't have a way to observe these behaviors. But remember that bell curve that had every interaction visible on the network? The trick is to build a security posture that relies on different data sources and tooling based on their strengths. Endpoint and logs will help you with the bulk of the pyramid, and the most advanced threats on the inside are visible on the network. And if you don't believe me, listen to the NSA. Quote, one of our worst nightmares is that out-of-band network tap that is really capturing all the data, understanding anomalous behavior that's going on, and someone's paying attention to it. You've got to know your network. Understand your network because we're going to. This quote is from Rob Joyce of the NSA. It's a few years ago now, but his point is that attackers can't hide from the network. The attacker's goal is to know the network better than you know it yourself. But the attacker will have no way of knowing if she's being watched if that network tool is out of band and totally invisible to the attacker. Today, unfortunately, advanced threat actors can pretty safely assume they're not being watched. But the companies who have adopted the network as a data source for defense will be the best prepared for advanced threats. Okay, so we got some good strategies for detection and analysis. What about the next phase of the NIST cycle? Containment and recovery, the last topic we haven't covered. Remember earlier how we said that we might have to burn it down and start again? That sounds bad. Let's not do that. How can we reassure ourselves that the bad actors didn't spread? My answer to that is the usual tools that we have, EDR and logs, but I'm going to add network data again. Because of how network telemetry works, you can store a large amount of the right forensics evidence for this kind of investigation and ultimately avoid burning it down and rebuilding. If you get hit by a less sophisticated attacker, you can likely be more surgical about your containment, eradication, and recovery processes. But in order to do so, you need to have evidence that goes back far enough that you can see when and where the attacker first entered your environment. Forensic evidence, preserved for as long as possible into the past, is a vital tool for reducing your chances of having to burn it down and rebuild. For example, In cases where the attack has a very long dwell time, nearly a year for Sunburst, and the attackers are likely maintaining their potential for access, but may not be using it very often, your opportunity to determine which users, hosts, or assets are compromised may be to trace the original moment of compromise or discover stealthy C2 traffic. Retaining forensic data for long periods is an important preparatory step for reducing the impact of future attacks. Think of it as less expensive than logs, but possibly just as useful. To wrap this up, let's look at our call to action. Let's start just like we did at the end of the NIST incident response cycle. Next week, conduct a retrospective. Reassess the risk you hold. Use the Sunburst attack as your guide and ask the questions I showed earlier. What could we do to stop that attack if it were done to us? What assets do we have that the attacker would have gone after? Next month, feed that back into your preparation steps so that you can answer questions quickly and reduce your cone of uncertainty when in the middle of an incident. Update your threat model and think about the defenses you need to put into place. 6 months from now, do it all again. You'll know more about the attacker techniques. You'll know more about your defenses. You'll have thought about those attacks and your defenses, and likely you will have come up with some novel countermeasures. In summary, advanced threats should change how we think about our risk and incident response strategies, as well as our threat models. Adversaries are learning from successful campaigns, so should we. Building resilience begins with retrospectives and assessing the risk you hold. Attackers have a limited playbook, which can be used to your advantage. Network monitoring is an attacker's worst nightmare. Enabling evidence preservation across your tooling will save your organization a lot of heartaches. And good security is about resilience, not being bulletproof. So with that, I'd like to thank you all and open up for the QA session now. Thanks.